Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the Tea Time with Dr. Tarver is a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. It's March, everyone, and I know you have heard the term March Madness throughout this month. This month's episodes of Tea Time with Dr. Tarver are going to focus on the things that are making us mad. Now, mad can be an emotion or a state of mind, and sometimes our interpretations of events and our consequent reactions to those events can lead to our madness. I'm sorry I missed you all last week, but it was a good decision for me to engage in some self care and not try to cram so many things in while I was traveling. So I am going to drop 2 episodes in one week to get us back on track. Now, we know that March is a month where we give special attention and celebration to women. Not that we don't deserve that attention every day, but it is Women's History Month, and we also celebrated International Women's Day last week. March is also the month where we do our college basketball, and we have tournaments, and we celebrate our champions in their respective leagues. But March is also a time when we start to possibly fall off of habits that we started maybe in January. And so you're noticing you're getting a little complacent in some of the things that you've been doing. Or March may be a time where you start over and you commit to getting reconnected to those goals because you know spring break is right around the corner. This is also a time where we often may revisit seeing healthcare providers as we go into this season because we got past the first of the month of the January, which is usually when people's deductibles start over. And so sometimes we put off some of those visits until we put something on that deductible a little bit. But whatever the case may be for you, this month is a great time of reflection and our ability to be able to recognize cycles and patterns. So I want to talk about a few things today. There have been a lot of videos, there have been a lot of posts that I've seen that have been really negative, frankly. You may have seen this viral video where a man professed he doesn't take care of his children because he told women up front that he didn't want children and he should not be responsible for a woman's choice to bring a child into the world. Maybe you've seen Chris Rock's Netflix special in response to being slapped by Will Smith last year. Or perhaps you have seen photos of Sierra being shamed for her attire and statements such as her husband is married, but clearly she's not based on her attire. Maybe you have seen some of the posts about Angela Bassett being called out for not clapping when she didn't win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. So, as you can see, there's a lot of madness, if you will, around us, and a lot of interpretations of events that people have. And so, this is a perfect time for me to get into you're headed for self destruction. This episode is dedicated to anyone who is trying to change an unhealthy cycle in your life, or something that potentially you may have learned growing up, or maybe a response to trauma that you want to break. And so, one of the things that we've realized is that when we experience trauma, survivors of trauma can recreate the events that traumatize them. And at times, the intent is to put themselves in positions of authority, to have control, to give themselves an opportunity maybe to do something different than they did in their trauma when they weren't able to make a different choice. However, what typically ends up happening is these patterns are usually self-destructive and really just puts the person back into a situation that feeds the core beliefs that they may have created over the years, which center around being powerless, hopeless, they don't make good decisions, they didn't handle a situation well, they're worthless, people aren't going to show up for them, people aren't can't be trusted, a person is responsible for what they receive, they deserve it. So what happens is self-destructive behaviors are typically triggered by uncomfortable emotions. We've talked about before that there aren't good emotions and bad emotions. However, there are definitely emotions that can make us feel more uncomfortable than others. Some of those may be fear, shame, disappointment, and anger, depending on how you grew up in your family. often dictates how you express or feel like you're able to express these things, and then how you feel when you experience these emotions. So, what are some examples of self destructive behavior? One of the easiest ones I think that people can understand is sometimes when we engage in sexual behaviors where we're being impulsive, detached, or disconnected. And what happens is we end up either positioning ourselves to be sexualized because that's the experience we received before in our trauma. That's the message we internalize in our trauma. And it's that I don't get a chance to make consent. I don't have control over what actually happens to my body. Or I go in this direction of I'm just going to focus on the pleasurable aspects of it and be detached so that I don't actually have to deal with the emotions that are connected to sex for me. And so I become numb, if you will. Other examples include overreacting in aggressive or hostile ways. You've probably seen people knock things over, yell, curse, scream, and it just seems like it's much more excessive than the situation would dictate. Okay, so that person didn't put your change back in your hand. That absolutely is rude. But did you need to knock over everything on their counter because of that? It could be that we curse out people when we feel misunderstood or dismissed. We may personalize the intentions of someone, so we'll start telling people what they meant by a behavior, even if that may not be accurate. And you'll see these frequently at banks, checkout lines, restaurants, where often there are things that could be happening that are frustrating. So you were late bringing me my food. I haven't seen you in an hour. We haven't had any refills on the drinks. You messed up my order. You didn't fix it. Something is going on with my bank account. Why isn't my check able to be fully deposited in my account? Why are you holding some of the money? Um, why are you snatching my items off this conveyor belt and putting them in the bag so aggressively? Right? And so we will respond in sometimes ways where we attack this other person because we feel minimized, right? And so we go back to trying to create that power dynamic. Um, but also, there may be this history we have of picking abusive partners, but then we internalize that it's our fault that the person is treating us in the way that they're treating us. And so we end up shrinking so we don't upset them, walking on the eggshells. Many of you may have heard that term before. We'll stay in relationships even when people don't value us. They can cheat on us. They spend the bill money. They're out gambling, doing whatever, supporting other people. They abandon us. They're not there for us. They disappear and then they'll pop back up after X amount of time has passed because they've been nurturing other relationships with other people. We tend to take responsibility for people in their emotions, and we don't want other people to be uncomfortable and not in a good space. And so we tend to focus on them and attend to them instead of our own needs. So those kind of self-destructive behaviors, if you will, also lead to emotional avoidance. They can be caused by emotional avoidance. They can also lead to emotional avoidance. And so what happens is we're trying to pursue these short-lived pleasures, if you will. So if this person likes me even for a moment, if I get this attention even for this moment, I'm going to live in that space and ignore all this other data that's coming in, the consequences of my behaviors, what it's doing to me to continue to be in a relationship with someone that doesn't value me, or all the times I've now been arrested because I keep getting violent with people and I've been banned from all these places because I've come in and tore these stores up. And I have owned that I'm not going to let anybody hurt me. And so I'm going to attack other people. And so I have this history of being abusive in relationships with people. Or perhaps I'm a person that's trying to control other people because I don't want them to leave me. And so I'm engaging in that kind of behavior. Now, what we also know about self-destructive behavior is it can appear as addictions, whether that's food or sex, substances. We've talked about some of that impulsive or risky sexual behavior. It also can look like self-harm, whether that's cutting, burning, or hair pulling. The other way that it can show up, and this is, I think, sometimes what people are less aware of, are the self-deprecating statements that we'll make, the criticism that we'll have about who we are and our worth and our value and what we're capable of, what we deserve. We'll cling to people, particularly people that have rejected us or people who have ended a relationship with us, or people who have expressed they're not interested in us. We'll change ourselves because we think that we'll be much more likely to be accepted. That's more pleasing to other people. But you also can see these self-harm behaviors in road rage and tardiness. And you may be thinking, tardiness. Well, sometimes what happens is we are unconsciously late because consciously we are concerned about what's going on at work. What if I'm not good enough? What if I make a mistake? What if they realize that I'm not as good at this as they think that I am? I don't want to get another negative evaluation. I had some distress the other day. And so this tardiness ends up becoming self-destructive because now it becomes a means to protect me from being able to, from having to deal with things that may be uncomfortable in my work environment. But also, we tend to procrastinate, which is another example of a self-harm behavior. And sometimes we do that because we're fearful of failure. Sometimes we do that because we're worried about what would it mean if I succeed? What will the expectations be placed on me then? So, why do we engage in self-destructive behaviors? We know that trauma, neglect, abuse are on the front line for some of those things. But also, we just have low self worth sometimes. We don't see ourselves as valuable and we don't see ourselves as deserving. And so, we engage in things that reperpetuate, if you will, that belief that we have. So, I'll continue to get involved with people who are going to confirm for me that I'm not of worth, I'm not of value, and whether that's jobs or relationships, I continue to have this pattern in my life. A history of rejection, being neglected in ways where you don't receive love, people don't stand up for you, people don't affirm you, people aren't there for you. These are some of the reasons why we don't feel like we have value as well. And often we will go and we will recreate the types of relationships we had with people who have rejected us. Maybe people we've grown up with, maybe some of our first relationships, may have been a first job, a teacher, a school experience that we had that shaped us in this way. And then also, it's really important for us to understand that sometimes there may be a mental health disorder that's underneath this self destructive behavior when we're depressed, when we're anxious, PTSD, right? So, our trauma disorders, eating disorders, personality disorders, and yes, even ADHD can be underneath these self destructive behaviors because often what comes along with these are avoidance, right? Most of the time, we are not wanting to deal with something, and so to put distance between us and something else will create these things that can be destructive. Or again, perfectionism, right? And procrastination, again, we've talked about, are sometimes what leads people with ADHD to engage in self-harm behaviors because they begin to think like, okay, something's wrong with me. I'm lazy. And so they begin to engage in patterns that confirm this negative belief that they have about themselves. So what do we do about it? You all know that I'm a big proponent of affirmations because it's important for us to do that self work. If we do not recognize the negative core beliefs that we have, we won't be able to change the ways we see ourselves. So, in understanding these negative views that we have of ourselves, we're able to then challenge them with more accurate information. We talked previously about what data do I have to support this. And sometimes bias has set in. And so self-fulfilling prophecy, like, yeah, here are all the ways I failed. And so I minimize the things that I've done that have been positive and I maximize the things that I've done that have been negative. And so it may take some work for you to be able to really find ways to affirm yourself because you may not believe them. You may actually believe that you're powerless, that you're helpless, that you're not safe, that people can't be trusted because these have been past experiences. And it may be significant work for you to find some examples of when that hasn't been the case. And sometimes for people, it comes from unlikely sources, all right? It might come from a member of a church or a coach. Or the person at the grocery store. It might come from that person who's at the drive-through that you see, right? And just being able to recognize, well, yeah, that person hasn't treated me in a negative way. And then we'll do the yes, but thing, right? Where we will say, but that's because they're paid to. It's like, there are plenty of people that are paid to give you good customer service and don't. So definitely a person is making a choice. And once we're able to challenge and replace those core beliefs with more positive ones, we build those new neural pathways, right? And so it becomes now more of an automatic process for me to think of some positive examples instead of just automatically thinking of the negative ones. It is very important that we practice being present. Mindfulness is very healthy and helpful when it comes to trying to create healthier patterns and be able to challenge some of the self destructive things that we're doing because it allows us to be present in what we're doing. Why am I making this choice right now? Do I engage in this pattern when I'm feeling overwhelmed, when I'm on the verge of succeeding, when I'm worried about me being enough or something that I'm doing being enough? And so instead of me being avoidant, the mindfulness allows me to be present in whatever I'm experiencing. So I want to be connected to my emotions instead of disconnecting, which is a tendency to do to avoid when we're uncomfortable. And yes, I will say to you, being present in your discomfort is important when you're trying to stop self-destructive patterns because it's important for you to understand I'm recreating an environment to confirm a negative belief about myself that's not accurate. I have the power to be able to make a different decision. I don't have to continue in this self destructive pattern, even if it's something that I've done continuously before. I definitely have the ability to move in a different direction. And that's being able to change one aspect of the cycle. Sometimes we feel like, oh, I have to make these huge changes. We've talked about before, it's more important for me to make small changes that I can sustain over time. The big change will come. But if I see this huge big picture of where I want to be, that can feel very overwhelming to me. And so, what am I going to do? I'm going to fall back into some of those self destructive patterns. It's important for me to learn how to soothe myself. We often will use people or things to be able to soothe ourselves when really we have the capacity to be able to soothe ourselves within. The mindfulness, the meditation, the grounding, things we've talked about before that will allow me to be able to be present and soothe myself, journaling. And it is okay, absolutely, to have a support system. But if I find that one of my self destructive patterns is I'm clinging to being dependent on reaching out to other people before I attempt to be able to address things within myself, what is that doing? It's reaffirming for me that I'm not capable. And so it's very important for me to recognize that I have the ability to try some things first. Right? My immediate go-to doesn't necessarily need to be a person. It depends on where you are in your process. But I do say that oftentimes we cheat ourselves of the experience of growing because we go to someone else to do that work for us. So it's important for me to recognize maybe part of my self destructive pattern is I don't trust my judgment. And so I'm continuing to do things that suggest when I make a decision myself that it's a bad decision. When really what I want to do is work on recognizing I can make a good decision, trusting that I can make a good decision, and affirming myself in the ability to do so by practicing making good decisions. And that doesn't mean there are not going to be missteps and mistakes along the way. That doesn't mean give up. We talked about when we were getting started with our goals for the year, how we'll say, oh, well, I've already messed up today, so forget it. I'm scratched the whole week. I'll start over next week. When it was like, hey, I had a misstep in that moment. That was that moment. What about this moment? I still have the capacity to make a different choice. I think that learning to directly address things can be complicated when we maybe have grown up in families that are avoidant. Because as we know, that's what road rage is about. Like all of these things that bubble up that seem like excessive responses to things are typically because I haven't dealt with something else, right? So there's powerlessness that I'm feeling, that you ignored me, you minimized me. One of the most frustrating things for me is when people take up all this extra space. So know you're on a crowded bus or train and you sitting with your legs so wide open it takes up 3 seats, and you are not considerate when the door opens. Instead of letting the people out that are closest to the door, you push your way through. Because what upsets me about that is because it feels like you have no regard for other people, that you don't value me, you don't see me, and I don't matter, right? And so that's some of the stuff that comes up with road rage. Is I'm like, how dare you, slow person, get in front of me, cut in front of me, take up all of this time turning this corner. because again, it brings up those things. So that's what needs to be addressed. It's not that I need to have a button to allow people to go back to start when they get in my way. Boop, back you go. Oh, you're rude. Okay, going back home. Now you got to get all the way back here again. It's really that I need to address that feeling of not being valued, not being seen. And so what ends up happening sometimes is we don't want to address that. And so we never learn how to actually get at what is underneath. That root cause is important. And that's why understanding that pattern is necessary for us to be able to change aspects of it. Because if I don't know why I'm doing something, it's definitely going to be difficult for me to try a different technique. Be mindful of how you're using your energy. So I'm a morning person. What happens is we are much more likely to be self-destructive during the times where we have the most energy. So when I wake up in the morning, one of my really bad habits was I would get on my phone and shop, right? Because that's when I tend to be more impulsive. I might have been on social media. I might have seen an ad because they target ads. And so here I am, I'm shopping. So one of the things that I've been intentional about is making sure that when I get up in the morning, I don't start my day on my phone. I don't get on social media. What I do instead is I start my day with either some prayers, some meditation, some exercise. Then I'm much less likely to be impulsive. I'm much more less likely to be self-destructive, right? Some of you are night people. And so all of your energy will be at night. And so you'll find at night, that's when you send in those texts to that ex, trying to slide back in there, trying to reconnect, even though this person has mistreated you. But that's also when you're more susceptible to people reaching out to you who are doing things that are going to be destructive, and you agree to them. You're like, well, yeah, I know I just said that you keep picking me up and putting me down whenever it's convenient, but it's nighttime and I'm excited. And so let's see what happens. Maybe you'll be different this time. So as you think about when you have the most energy, be intentional and purposeful about how you're going to make healthy choices, right? This is when it's important maybe to block somebody. This may be when it's important for you to be engaged in some purposeful activity that will allow you to be focused on something that's wellness based instead of something that's self-destruction based. Now, we also know that it's very important for us to understand where we're going. And so if you evaluate if your behaviors are consistent with your goals, oftentimes, and this is the mindfulness piece, then I can think about, hey, the consequence of that. Because that's one of the things that happens when we're self-destructive is we're avoidant. We don't actually want to deal with the consequences. We don't want to live in that space. I want to live in the space of finding this pleasure in this moment, this escape in this moment, if you will. But if I think about what is the outcome of this behavior, and if this behavior is going to be consistent with the goals I have for myself, then that also gives me another opportunity to make a different choice. Now we know, and I had to get a plug in for therapy, that you may need therapy in order for you to be able to embark on this process. These skills are not something that are just necessarily going to be self-created. You may need some work to do. You may need some accountability, particularly if the people around you are still engaging in self-destructive patterns. That's why we talk about the importance of changing your environment as well. If I want to be different, I can't be still around people that's cursing out everyone and flipping over stuff, right? Because I'm trying to change that behavior. That behavior is destructive to me. I've been arrested 5 times behind that. And so this is now causing a negative impact. I'm having these consequences that are affecting my ability to be employed and be able to go to places freely, and also my relationships. So let me not continue to be around people who are engaging in behaviors that I want to change. This message will not self-destruct. So if you grew up watching Inspector Gadget or some of the other shows, you would see the message is going to self-destruct after you read it. This message will not self-destruct after you hear it. It is important that you recognize you can change course. You just need to know what route to take. Be well.